So welcome everybody. If you're just joining us, we're going to get started with our panel today in just a moment. We're just giving everybody a moment to get connected and logged into the audio portion of this webinar so that they can hear us. We will get started in just a moment. Just so everyone knows, we are recording today's session, so we will share the link out with all of you afterward. We know many more folks wanted to be here who couldn't be here today, so we're excited to be able to share this later. We'll go ahead and kick ourselves off with this wonderful panel who you're going to meet in just a few moments. We're going to be talking today about the untapped potential of controlled digital lending. And just as a quick introduction, I'm Jill Morris. I'm the Executive Director of PALCI, and this is one of our panel presentations that is a part of our 2020 member meeting series. We had initially hoped to have this presentation in person at an event in Pittsburgh in June, but we were very fortunate to be able to switch gears quickly and host these events online instead. As a quick thank you, and I'm going to advance my slide, hopefully, if it'll work. Quick thank you to our sponsors who helped us make this event happen, both ProQuest and EBSCO. If you see them or any of your reps, please do say thank you to both of them for their sponsorships of these meetings. As a quick reminder, we do have a PALCI Code of Conduct. I won't go through and read the full thing to you today, but I do want to remind everybody that this Code of Conduct applies to all events, whether they're in person or virtual. And our board approved this Code of Conduct in May of this year. So please check it out if you haven't had an opportunity to do so yet. And up next, I'm going to quickly turn it over to Kornelia Tancheva, who is our moderator and a panelist in today's session. And Kornelia, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hi, everybody. So very nice to see over 50 people attending this panel. Welcome and thank you for joining us. We have a really exciting slate of panelists for you today. Dave Hansen from Duke University, Alan Jones from the New School, and Sebastian Hammer from Index Data, and myself, I'm the University Librarian at the University of Pittsburgh. So this is how we envision our panel today. First, Dave is going to talk about controlled digital lending in general and the developments with the Internet Archive and the publisher's lawsuit. Then I will say a few words about the larger issues that controlled digital lending brings up, namely the right of libraries to engage in digital resource sharing and the position of the Association of Research Libraries. For those of you who are not aware, I'm the chair of the Policy, Advocacy and Policy Committee of the ARL. Then Alan Jones from the New School will review a few use cases and standards, and specifically ISO 18626. And finally, Sebastian Hammer will talk specifically about share, and we've kept this as our last mini presentation because I'm sure that many of you are really eager to learn more about share, which is an exciting development for PALCI. And I'm sure you will have a lot of questions for all of the panelists, but possibly most for Sebastian. Each of the panelists will have about 8 minutes, and panelists, I will be monitoring very, very closely your 8 minutes because we want to leave enough time for questions and answers at the end. Jill and James are going to help me monitoring the question and answer window in case there are so many questions that I somehow omit one. We do ask that you reserve your questions till after all the panelists have finished. Now, Dave, you suddenly disappeared from my screen of panelists. I do hope that you are there. Yes, you are there. Good.
I am.
So I'm going to turn it over to you. Thank you.
Great. Thank you, Kornelia. I guess I'll just start off with a little bit of background on me, because that'll help explain what I will talk through here. I am Associate University Librarian for Research, Collections, and Scholarly Communications at Duke. I am also our lead copyright and information policy advisor, and I'm one of these folks who is both a lawyer and a librarian, and depending on which day it is, I might answer with one of those two roles first. But a lot of what I'm going to talk about right now is some of the legal aspects of controlled digital lending, because controlled digital lending at its core is really a legal theory under which, looking at the breadth of copyright law, it's a legal theory that is designed to allow libraries to do things that they have always done, which is lend books. So the first thing I'm going to talk through with you is, well, first I have a screenshot up here of the website, which I would recommend you go visit and read through if you're interested in this subject, because it has a lot more detail than what I can cover in 8 minutes, including a sort of short and long version of the legal rationale, as well as a number of FAQs about how this works in practice, and a nice news feed on kind of what's happening around the country and around the world with different people doing controlled digital lending. So that website, I was a part of a small group that helped set that up. It included the drafters that are listed on the position statement that you'll see there, and that position statement, one of the things we tried to do in creating it was to draft it in such a way that it could receive broad support to help people kind of understand both what the issues are, but also what kind of organizations are interested and supportive of this kind of approach to digital lending of library materials. So you'll find all the names listed on there. The document on that website that goes through the legal theory in depth is the white paper link there that I co-authored with Kyle Courtney, who's copyright advisor at Harvard University. So I don't want to give you a whole law school lecture, but it's important to understand some aspects of how copyright law works. So for that, can I get the next slide? Here's the table of contents of Chapter 1 of the Copyright Act, which is a pretty kind of librarian way of starting a discussion about copyright law, but it actually is a very helpful starting point to understand the balance of rights that belong to owners of copyrights and the rights that belong to owners of copies of things. And so the way this is split up is you see in section 101 through 106A, you have certain rights that are granted to copyright owners. And I won't go through all of those, but it's a pretty basic set of rights when you read them. In section 106, that's where the exclusive rights are really laid out. And it says copyright owners get the exclusive right to control things like reproduction of their work and public performance of their work. And one of the rights that's granted to copyright owners is the right to control public distribution of their work. And if you stop and you think about what that means for a moment, it sounds awfully broad and controlling, right? So public distribution of a work that I created, that could mean that I authored, let's say, a book. And under just those exclusive rights, that would mean that I get to control all of the different ways that that work gets distributed out to the public in copies on the internet, all sorts of formats. And so that's where the limitations and exceptions that are built into copyright become really, really important. So one of those limitations is called the first sale doctrine. This is included in the Copyright Act in section 109. And you'll see the text there is really small. Limitations on exclusive rights, the effect of transfer of a particular copy. So what the law talks about there is it says, yes, copyright owners get to control distribution of their work, but there's a limitation on that distribution right. And that limitation is once the copyright owner sells a copy that contains the work within it, the owner of that copy has certain rights, right? And it says that once you buy that copy, those distribution rights are exhausted, and the owner of that copy can do a whole bunch of stuff. And that's how we lend books in libraries is we are not inhibited by the public distribution right to be prevented from lending out books physically or disposing of books books if we need to weed, or all sorts of things like that. So that right has been long recognized in the Copyright Act for well over a century in the statutory text. But it doesn't really work very well for digital lending. And the reason why that alone doesn't work well for digital lending is the way the statute is written. It's specifically addressing just the public distribution right, but it doesn't address the other sets of rights that copyright owners get. And specifically the one that matters for digital distribution is the reproduction right. Because when I'm physically lending a book, right, I can just hand the book to you and I don't have to make a copy of it. But when I'm digitally lending a book to you, technically I have to make a copy on my machine and I have to make a copy on your machine. And so there are these additional rights that are involved there. And that's where fair use comes in. So the whole controlled digital lending approach depends on fair use. And it says, you know, fair use is this flexible doctrine that allows copyright to sort of react to new technologies, to new developments in a way that balances the rights between rights holders and the rights of users. And so the CDL theory says, well, what copyright really worries about is preserving the economic market for the original, not harming owners' incentive to create, but also allowing people to do things that they need to that are economically significant with those copies that they've purchased. And so CDL at its core tries to preserve that balance. And one way it does that is by kind of approximating the physical lending environment in the digital environment. So that means if you have one physical copy of a book, you can only lend one copy of that book at a time. And so in the digital environment, we say we think that the reasonable approach is to only allow one person to look at that copy at a time, to check it out in the same way that you would the physical copy, and then critically to maintain that owned to loaned ratio. So if you only own one physical copy, you shouldn't be allowing people to look at the physical copy at the same time as the digital. So that's the legal basis. Next slide, please. So there are a bunch of kind of additional factors under fair use that you want to look at here. Those of you who have thought about fair use before have thought about these kind of market harm issues. I just want to flag these. I'm not going to talk about these in a lot of detail. You can read what's up here, but there are lots of different approaches to CDL that don't involve scanning absolutely every title in your collection, scanning materials that, you know, just are pretty obviously high risk items. So next slide. And I just want to present one way of thinking about this is to think about the actual materials in your collection in a few different ways. And this is just reproduced from that white paper, identifying a few different kind of nested categories, excuse me, of material that have different risk levels. And this is actually the approach that we're taking at Duke to this, where we are trying to tackle eventually, hopefully once there is a reshare CDL solution, we'd like to be able to scan actually any book in our collection that we cannot buy an ebook copy for. We would like to be able to scan and do CDL for any book that's 1989 or before. So next slide. I think I'm out of time, but maybe we can get to this in the Q&A, is the Internet Archive has been sued. And I guess the short version of the lawsuit is they've been sued, and it implicates controlled digital lending, but it also implicates a lot of other things that the Internet Archive is doing that I think are distinguishable from some of the activities that research libraries would be undertaking under a CDL approach.
So I guess I'm up. Thank you very much, Dave. So I am just going to riff off of something that Dave was saying in the 8 minutes that I have. But I want to start with the widespread notion that the present crisis or urgency, if you will, of the pandemic is what CDL is all about. In other words, now we are pushing more for CDL because the pandemic showed that it is necessary. My position is actually that this is a false premise. I believe that we are facing a crisis, not just as the result of the pandemic, but we have actually been facing this crisis ever since we, as a library profession, allowed publishers to basically circumvent an essential right that libraries have been granted under the Copyright Act, which Dave so conveniently pointed out to me in the doctrine of the first sale and fair use. And this is the right of libraries to share resources rather than be limited to buying one copy of an electronic book, say, and then not being able to use it for interlibrary loan. So in my opinion, controlled digital lending is much larger than the present issue that we are facing, larger than the lawsuit against the Internet Archive. So what we need to work towards is a fair and equitable digital first sale doctrine that allows digital resource sharing, be it through interlibrary loan for ebooks or through controlled digital lending as we now know the practice. I do want to say a few words about the lawsuit against the Internet Archive. It is very carefully crafted, and hopefully many of you or all of you have been able to take a look at least some of the summaries that have appeared, because publishers are very careful there to not target libraries by insisting that the Internet Archive is actually not a library. So this is a point of contention. We can argue whether the Internet Archive is a library or not, but it is almost like a red herring in my opinion, because the lawsuit is actually not so much about the Internet Archive. It is expansive. It attacks the whole practice of controlled digital lending. And what is even more harmful to my mind is that it overreaches and tries to actually revisit a battle that libraries have already won, or at least partially won, when some years ago publishers wanted the digital copies destroyed of books that Google Books or HathiTrust have digitized. So speaking of the HathiTrust, understandably, they have been trying very carefully to circumscribe what their emergency access has been so far within the limits of the pandemic. The argument there goes, libraries are closed, their collections are inaccessible to patrons, hence the e-version can be checked out to one person at a time. But they're also very careful not to say that they're doing controlled digital lending. And we can debate that point. Is that controlled digital lending or what is it? However, what I want to talk about is the fact that controlled digital lending in many of its permutations is not universally accepted by libraries or by university administration and specifically general counsel, who sometimes feel a little skittish about the implications. So the first part, not universally accepted by all libraries and librarians, also makes it really hard for professional librarian organizations to speak with one voice about controlled digital lending. And I'm sure Dave has stories to tell about that. Next slide, please. So one such professional organization is the Association of Research Libraries in North America, which many of us are members of, and which has a very strong advocacy voice in the legislative and policy arena. So as I said, I'm the chair of the Advocacy and Public Policy Committee. And here is how the ARL position has evolved. When the white paper on controlled digital lending appeared first, the member organizations of ARL could not actually agree on a unified position, so that's why ARL did not endorse the white paper. But what happened with the Internet Archive lawsuit? And this is what what happened. I'm giving you a little bit of backstage information. The Advocacy and Public Policy Committee prepared a draft for a statement in defense of the Internet Archive, which we presented to the board of ARL, and they ultimately endorsed it. I've provided the link to this particular statement. As a result, because the committee advocated with the board, ARL also signed on to the position statement on CDL that Dave was referring to. Still, both of those are very much, not both of those, but at least the statement in support of the Internet Archive is very much couched in terms of the pandemic, and we need to do that now. However, our Advocacy and Public Committee has been thinking well beyond the pandemic. Okay, so we are in the middle of a pandemic, it goes away, hopefully, I'm sure we all hope for that. And then what? Do we return back to the state that we have now with that lawsuit looming? So we have been working on priorities that are post-COVID, if you will. And for us, the priority is to advocate and advance law and policy for balanced copyright that safeguards the interests of researchers and learners. And you can read the rest of this, but I want to point out balance that safeguards the interests of researchers and learners, because what we have at this point in time in the digital environment is that the balance has been skewed in favor of the producers of the works. So what that means is that we are now focusing on digital first sale and first use as one of our advocacy initiatives. So this is how I'm returning to my initial point. It is not about the pandemic. It is all about fair use and first sale. Thank you. And now we'll move on to Alan.
Hi, everyone. My name is Alan Jones. I'm the Director of Digital Library and Technical Services at the New School. I also work as a co-convener of the Reshare Subject Matter Experts Group. I have the privilege to participate in that group. People have been talking about kind of lofty-ish ideas in terms of for sale. I'm going to really talk about kind of what we're thinking about this in terms of on the ground. There was a small group of who met to talk particularly about use cases. I guess this was prior to or late last year, early this year, that met specifically to talk about 3 different areas that controlled digital lending could actually work in. The first, as it probably is no surprise to anyone, was course reserves and the lack of physical ability to circulate rapidly or quick loans, particularly in a COVID type of situation where both the transfer of physical material was risky, as well as the fact that many of our students were actually turning to more remote types of applications. And the glut of non-digitized material was really important to be able to support coursework when there wasn't a readily available ebook available. Traditional normal circulation, where again, I'm in an institution that had 10,000 FTE. There were not 10,000 FTE on campus using the libraries in the midst of this COVID. At the same time, what that meant was that a significant portion of our collection was actually unavailable. In fact, our offsite storage was more available than our on-campus stuff, because we were able to facilitate home delivery. And then what a lot of different spaces are talking about in terms of interlibrary loan are, we're used to shipping books back and forth to one another. What we really saw with controlled digital lending was kind of a next step or an evolution of that wouldn't necessarily require us to pay postage, as well as all of the other kind of indirect costs that were that are associated with that type of transaction. So the next slide. So as you've heard, particularly with the HathiTrust and Internet Archives, there have been a number of different initiatives that have been going on. There certainly is the emergency library. And I'm going to say, without the emergency library or without the Hathi, I don't think we would be able to have the concepts that we do today. So I really want to applaud both their Brewster Colley in particular for taking on and looking at the risk, but also seeing the benefit that having an emergency library like the Open Libraries Project has been paying off. Even more readily than that are smaller initiatives that are using low-tech in terms of either Google Drive or OneDrive, the Microsoft version of Google Drive's type of trying to cut off access to PDFs or other things that are in different folders. That's an extremely kind of manual process. The other thing it doesn't do is it doesn't connect to the inventory management system that that many of us have in terms of our ILSs. There are other programs that are going on right now. I want to mention Michael Rodriguez at the University of Connecticut, who's really kind of thinking about and spearheading this concept of what DRM free actually is within the interlibrary loan space. One of the things that UConn is doing is actually distributing DRM free ebooks as interlibrary loans. Now, that's a very intriguing model when we think about it. So if something actually doesn't have any digital rights, who are the patrons there, and can we freely exchange that material? And then there are other more emerging models that are coming out that are actually looking at things like digital asset management systems and trying to restrict access to those digital objects. Again, not necessarily tied to circulation, but at least ensuring that there's one loan or there's one particular viewer of that digital object at a time. So all of these different things are kind of happening kind of at this time of COVID, and very much similar to what it is that Kornelia was talking about. This is kind of in the air. And so rather than thinking about all of these different initiatives, what Reshare is really trying to do is kind of grab certain things from all of these different places and see if we can actually put it into a system that basically connects to the inventory management system to guarantee some of that right of first sale. Next slide. So at the same time that all of this is going on, I'm also a member of the ISO 18626 community. Kornelia, I owe you $5 because you were the first person to say 18626 in this presentation. So basically what you're seeing here is between a requesting application and a supplying application, the communication that's actually happening when somebody requests a book. Now, previously, there were other protocols that actually did this. One of the most recent renovations that have happened has been the inclusion of a shipper as well as a tracking ID to support home delivery. Next slide. And you can see that between the conversation that the requester is having and that the supplier is having, that this is a transaction of a physical book. So the supplier is basically saying, or the requester is basically saying, do you have this copy of World War Z? Yes, I do. I can ship it. I will ship it. And then the supplier basically sends it with the tracking ID. And then the requester, when they're actually shipping the book back, will supply the supplier with the tracking ID so that they can get, so that they can basically track their book, close out the application, and be done. One of the things that happened with the, it was kind of a fortuitous situation, is that 18626 was revising its protocol. Next slide, please. And what we started looking at was not only a delivery format of physical material, but you'll also see there that there's a delivery format tag for PDFs. And you can also see that there's a response from the supplier saying, okay, here's the PDF, here's the URL of that particular PDF, it can be managed digitally. Here's the expiration of that element. And so with beginning at this very, very low level of basic network communication, we can begin to support things like controlled digital lending. And with that, I just want to say that controlled digital lending for reshare isn't just about access, but it's actually about preserving the custodianship of holdings within a standards-based lending marketplace. So if you can bring 18626 together with the actual ownership of that material, we should be able to digitally lend that material. And this is my really kind of slick setup for Sebastian, who's going to take us kind of on a technical tour of what that might actually look like.
Wonderful. Thank you, Alan. And now that you've done my job of or letting Sebastian take over, I don't even have to do that. So Sebastian, you're on.
Thank you, Kornelia, and hello, everybody. I'm Sebastian. I'm one of the co-founders of Index Data. Index Data is one of the 2 software companies that is participating in Project Reshare. And so in that role, I'm also a member of a Project Reshare steering committee, which to my mind, and perhaps I'm biased, is one of the finest committees in Project Reshare. It's one of the really unique aspects of Reshare that we have this group that thinks about the project from a strategy point of view in terms of threats and opportunities that the project faces in terms of resources and funding. So it was that group that very early this year, as the current crisis started to really take hold, began to think about the impact on the project. And we were realizing both that the project itself was impacted in the sense that we had really planned to spend the summer thinking about and implemented and very much testing logistics for handling print materials in Project Reshare. We had and we have grand ideas for deep integration between the Reshare application and shipping companies and so on. All of that was looking to be very difficult, but we could also see that as libraries were struggling to deal with the challenges that were put in front of them, CDL was looking like a tool that could really make a difference. I very much agree with Kornelia that CDL is not and should not be thought of as limited to being a response to coronavirus. And in fact, CDL had been one of about half a dozen strategic initiatives that had been on Project Reshare's long-term roadmap almost since we started the project. It had felt to the project that CDL was very much an extension of Reshare's vision of moving towards virtualized collections where interlibrary loan was just one facet that included shared collection management, shared print management, and so on. And the ability to move materials around digitally between consortial members was very much in that vein and part of that family. We also felt like there was some really interesting overlaps between what we imagined a CDL tool to be and what we were already building for Project Reshare. The ability to talk to a local ILS, the ability to implement policies and workflows, and ultimately the ability to speak to and exchange requests with other libraries all seemed like they could have a fit. So there was a sense, and has been a sense, that CDL, again, is a natural fit for consortial collaboration. So the next slide talks about what we have done so far in Project Reshare. As Alan mentioned, we chartered a working group relatively early this year to start to explore the use cases and the implications of CDL for local library operations. And what I mean by that is the white paper and the abstract notions of CDL really focus on sort of the big picture. Why is it legal? How does it work? How might you protect yourself from litigation? What are some strategies you can employ? What we were trying to do was to get back to sort of base principles of what would this look like if applied within a library, and from that deriving a design, hopefully, for a set of tools that might help a library implement some of these practices. So we worked through CDL and thought about it from a standpoint of these library policies. Who do you want to lend to? What materials in your collection might you subject to CDL? What are the terms you apply? How does this affect the experience of a library patron? How does it impact staff workflows? How does it fit into existing models for resource access, including, again, policies, loan policies and rules, statistics and metrics and so on? How does it impact processes that you might have to have already and need to put in place for digitization and storage and the application of DRM technology, which is new to a lot of libraries? Starting from that point, that analysis, we then set up a subgroup that really tried to kind of outline the high-level functional requirements for an application. We said, let's imagine that we're building a tool to help individual libraries do this. What does that tool look like? What sort of features and functions does it have? And what would constitute a minimally viable product, a baseline what we could aim for and that we could achieve within a fairly short period of time. We have just launched, or are just in the process of launching a new SME group, a subset of the group that Alan referred to, with some new members as well, that will work in tandem with the development team as we start to work on this into the fall and winter. To provide testing and input and feedback on wireframes and designs and so on. And there's another working group that also includes Alan and myself that is evaluating existing DRM technologies that we might adopt in the project. We're hoping very much to stay agnostic to DRM approaches, but to try to support existing workflows and processes that libraries have in place to support non-returnables already, and basically find ways that we can slot in the CDL part on top of these existing processes to minimize the impact on library processes and workflows. The last thing I'll mention is that the steering committee is working really actively on pursuing funding and resourcing in terms of development assistance, in terms of funding. And that's everything from going out to ask for grant funding to reaching out to individual consortia and libraries to help support this effort, which we think is really important. And in the next slide, I'll just talk really briefly about kind of the anatomy of the software that we are planning to build. And for those of you who have seen Project Reshare's presentations and demos, in many ways, I imagine at the moment that you'll see CDL evolve as an extension to the request management and patron and workflow management that we already have in Project Reshare. So you, in a sense, you want to try to imagine CDL requests coming in from a patron as just another kind of request that you can process in the Reshare application. So the middle bar is essentially where the software will be focused, the green area. You'll see mechanisms for managing requests and approving those requests, applying policies to those, printing PIC slips, supporting scanning workflows, patron notices. And then finally, you'll see along the way, you'll see integration with the ISO 18626 functionality that's already built into Reshare to support the transparent transfer of requests between consortium members. So you can have multiple consortium members collaborating to meet the needs of patrons. On the top in the blue area, you'll see Reshare, or you'll see the Reshare CDL application integrate with existing scanning and file management workflows when they exist, and with DRM tools to manage delivery. And finally, in the brown bar at the bottom, you'll see a lot of the existing variations, of close variations of the existing functionality that we have for managing patron identification, real-time availability, check-in, check-out, and so on. I'll just say very quickly, if we can have the next slides, and I know I'm out of time, but I want to call out the Controlled Digital Lending Implementers group that Project Reshare and Stanford Libraries started together. The group is really intended to try to promote best practices and to hopefully form a community of practice around CDL. The vision from my perspective is to have the community and to have libraries own the notion of what constitutes best practices for CDL, so it doesn't become the property of a large technology company or a group of publishers. We want to create an open forum where people can talk about their needs and challenges, and I'd encourage people to go visit, sign up, and use that as a resource. And that's me. Thank you, Kornelia.
Thank you very much to all of our panelists. This is the question and answer portion. We have about 20 minutes. So while we are waiting for questions to appear in the question and answer portion or in chat, however works for the participants, I'm just going to summarize. We've presented some very different perspectives from a perspective that's very rooted in the legal regime to an advocacy perspective of what the legal regime might or should look like in the future, to very concrete examples, plus a tool that would help all of us at PALCI and many other libraries. So hopefully that has given you enough to pique your interest so that you can ask questions. While we are waiting for that, one of the things that we wanted to make sure that you all get out of it are concrete recommendations. So I'm going to ask the question that we have. Oh, and questions are starting to appear. Oh no, that's James. At any rate, one of the things that we wanted all the participants to leave this panel with are concrete recommendations. So I'm going to ask the question that you are seeing on the slide here to each of our panelists. What one recommendation do you have for today's participants who want to get started with CDL on their campus? So let's start with Dave, because it's been a while since he has talked.
Yeah, so CDL is not a risk-free proposition, right? So Internet Archive is being sued right now, and it's a legal theory that we have pretty good markers in the case law, and I think there's a strong case for it, but it is not absolutely risk-free. Of course, you can't be risk-free with anything, but I think it's important to then start with a conversation with counsel on your campus about trying to educate them about what it is. That's part of the reason why we wrote the white paper, is to help people be able to explain the legal rationale behind it, but then also progress from there into a discussion about what this could practically look like on your campus, given your counsel's approach to risk.
All right, thank you. Alan? You have to unmute yourself.
Yep, sorry about that. Jill would kill me if I didn't say this, so join reshare. One thing that I do think, in all seriousness though, every librarian should learn much more about first sale and the concept and the notion of first sale. There is, I think that controlled digital lending, we have to stop taking it and talking about it in terms of fair use and really talk about it as our ability in this next generation to lend. And so I would strongly recommend that as much as people know about Section 107, they should know about 109 just as strongly.
All right, Sebastian?
I want to give a shout out to the CDL white paper, and I would encourage everybody who hasn't read it to read it. It's a really great resource. It's very readable, and I found it actually entertaining. But otherwise, I'm going to have to call out the CDLI. I think as what I'm hoping will be a really great resource for people to follow along. I can only kind of back up and emphasize what people have already said. If you want to be prepared, you need to learn about this stuff. You need to engage in the conversations with your counsel and start to explore practical solutions, whether that's working with Internet Archive or engaging with what we're doing in Project Reshare.
And just so that I add to practically the same advice, learn about CDL, learn about the lawsuit, and talk to your counsel, but remember, general counsel, remember, those are the people who are trying to keep your institution out of lawsuits. So you need to understand the issues and be able to explain those issues to them in a way that would convince them that yes, there is a risk, but it is a calculated risk. Dave, I can see that you want to say something, and then if we can go to the questions in the chat.
Yeah, so one just recommendation on strategies for talking about risk related to this. I think it's really helpful with counsel to recognize that this is not risk-free, but to also talk through some of the countervailing risks. I think sometimes we approach things as if, you know, copyright is this big, scary thing, and there's nothing else countervailing on the other side. But I think there are. I mean, right now, in the current situation, we have lawsuits being filed left and right against universities with students saying, you didn't provide me the educational experience that you promised because you kicked me off campus. That's a countervailing risk, and part of the way we can mitigate some of that is by saying, look, we're providing the library to you digitally. Another countervailing risk there is we have lots of people on our campuses who have disabilities, who cannot get into our libraries in ways that we just sort of assume that they can. And that's a pretty big risk for institutions as well, and CDL helps address that. So yes, it probably does raise some risk on the copyright side of things, but it helps mitigate some risks in some other areas as well. Not the least of which, beyond those things that I just listed, which are really legal oriented, is the overall mission risk of, like, why are we here to begin with? We're here to get access to information to people. We're here to help them learn. And if we tell them that the only way that you can do that is by finding a parking spot on our campus, which can be like one of the biggest barriers for a lot of us, getting into our library and pulling these books out physically, that's just not a good enough answer, I think, for a lot of people now. And so that's a pretty big mission risk that I think we need to address as well.
Thank you. So we have a comment from David Ranian that you have set up a new Microsoft SharePoint digital lending system. Do you want to tell us a few words about that? David, if you're still with us. Can we perhaps unmute him, or he is unmuted, Jill?
I've just given him the ability to unmute himself if you would like.
Okay.
Thanks. I can say a couple things. We've worked with our IT office to set up a Microsoft SharePoint setup. Forgive me for not understanding all of the right vocabulary working through the Microsoft system, but I understand it's a SharePoint list. We can upload our items, whether they're PDFs or other ebook files, into that system. We can set up discoverability by cataloging them in our Alma system, and then noting that each item is available on request only. Our students can find those items, then request them, and then we can share through the SharePoint system directly with that individual. No copying, no printing, no downloading of those items is allowed, and we have it set to flag us after a due date has been reached, so that we can shut off access to that item and give it to somebody else if desired, or we can renew that item for the user who has that. It doesn't yet achieve everything that some of these other systems do, particularly with ILL options, but it is allowing us to make a lot of items available to our students and to our faculty who are scattered around the world at this time, in a way that I think protects our back as far as copyright goes, and embraces that first sale doctrine. We've got one digital copy for each item that we own or have licensed, and if we have more copies, we can share it multiple times.
Then we have a question, thank you. We have a question from Carly Husted. I'd like to hear what the panelists' pie in the sky dream goal would be at the end of the day regarding CDL. Panelists, would one of you want to take this one?
I can take a shot.
Go ahead.
So what I really like about software, the way my mind works, is I get excited about the idea of reducing friction and increasing the quality of service by reducing friction in systems. And there was a moment I remember in the working group that we had, our first working group that also included David Hansen, when we got into a conversation about sort of the intersection of consortial services and CDL, where I remember feeling chills when I started to imagine a scenario where we used the shared index of reshare and the service directory to share, not just do sort of interlibrary loan of individual titles, but to share the work and the storing of those digital copies for future use, where you could imagine that we have this kind of network where different libraries could put in different kinds of resources. So maybe a library needs to lend something to its patron, and it's turned out that another library has already scanned it, or they have it on the shelf and they're willing to scan it on your behalf. And you could almost start to see the efforts of the different kinds of resources that each library has being something that we can network and share across a consortium. And that, I mean, it sounds dorky, but that just made me super excited, because it felt like a huge step towards really virtualizing a lot of the services that we provide to patrons and the kinds of workflows we have in libraries. And that seemed very powerful to me.
Thank you. Anybody else? We do have other comments and questions, but I want to give everybody a chance to talk about pie in the sky.
Pie in the sky for me basically is making sure that regardless of what stack you're in, whether it's Alma, Rapido, whatever, that the or whether it's Reshare, Folio, whatever, that we're actually able to borrow and lend to one another. And I don't necessarily think that that's high in the sky. I mean, that's what information standards are for. And I just think we need to be cognizant of that, because particularly in the library technology market where there's such hyper consolidation, I think it's very easy to develop for things that you know, as opposed to develop out. Now, one of the other things that I'll also say that I've been increasingly, particularly with some of the NISO work that I've been doing, all of the vendors understand the same the same danger. And they've worked actually very hard and very well to be compatible with some of those standards like 1866. And I really look forward to the continued development in that direction. But pie in the sky for me is basically that the ILS doesn't determine who I lend to.
All right, Dave, did you have something that you wanted to add?
Yeah. So pie in the sky to me is, it was 17 years ago that Google started digitizing University of Michigan collection, University of California collection, and just started plowing through shelves and shelves of books. And we still don't have broad open access to that material. And we may never get broad open access to those particular scans, but to me, pie in the sky is that we have kind of a light at the end of the tunnel for cracking the 20th century black hole problem. I think, you know, for books that have been published in the last 10 years, we have pretty good digital access options for many of them. But between, you know, 1924 or so and the late 90s, it's just a massive, massive problem to figure out how to get digital access to folks there. And I think consortially, an application of CPL that's consortial really would make a lot of progress towards opening up that content in a way that doesn't decimate copyright holders' markets for those works, but in a way that also leverages all of the purchasing that all of our libraries already did for those materials. I mean, we spent millions and millions of dollars acquiring that content. And for a lot of our users, especially younger users, it's like invisible to them. They don't even consider using it given the format that it's in, and that's just dumb to me.
So there was a reason why I mentioned the digital files and Google and HathiTrust, because that is what I feel is behind this whole Internet Archive lawsuit. Now, we are almost out of time here. We have 3 minutes and a number of comments and questions. If we don't get to all of them, Jill, I'm hoping that we can put the emails of each of the panelists and mine too. If people want to follow specifically on a question that I don't get to, so if the PowerPoint is available with the emails, that would be really good. And let's see, there was a comment.
Kornelia, I just want to say one other thing. And that's that we should also be looking at ebook platforms as loanable materials. And so we do need to be pressing our vendors to include interlibrary loan in the contracts that we're signing. And that's something that every librarian on this call could do. In terms of guaranteeing for their institution that they can actually circulate that material. Setting yourself up for that is a good way to begin starting to do CDL, because there may already be digital objects that don't need to be scanned.
Yes, as I told Jill some time ago when she was asking me what is important for library directors in the licenses that PALCI negotiates, I will not sign a license that does not allow me to do interlibrary loan on ebook. Right. So let me just go quickly through the comments and the questions and at least point people in the right direction. There's a comment from Barry Schless saying that they're starting to use Digify to add DRM to files for CDL lending. And that is another platform and another instance. We talked about the pie in the sky dream. And then there's a question about working with government bodies and lobbyists to make sure that we are moving the law to work for the public in the libraries instead of just private interest. So Andrew, I'm more than happy to address that question if you send me an email. But if the question is about how is PALCI working, because I can talk about how ARL is working with government bodies and lobbyists, then you should definitely ask Jill so you can copy both of us. Then there's a little bit of levity here between David, and Jill is sending the white paper. Okay, there are very specific questions. When a library has an unlimited licensed copy, first sale does not apply. Can we set a rule that makes CDL possible? Dave, do you think that this is a question that I can send your way after the panel? Perfect. So Angela, if you can contact Dave.
There's also a question from Jeremy in the Q&A box.
Yes, I saw that one too, just trying to get to the end of the chat box. Okay, that's it. And then Jeremy, I think that your question also goes to Dave, right? If you're seeing it, Dave. And there might be another one here, or no, that's it. So I think we are 1 minute over time. I apologize for that. I was very diligent about keeping time. I would like to thank all of our panelists, also PALCI, for organizing this, and every one of you who attended. This is an extremely important topic, and we need to stay on top of it and forge ahead. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Kornelia, and thank you to all of our panelists. What I'll do is I'll copy the questions out of the chat, and I will refer to our panelists and bring them back to you in the last slides before we share them out with you all. So you can expect to see responses to some of these questions we didn't quite get to. I will let you know that PALCI is actively engaged in this space, and we're working with our colleagues in other consortia as well. And so I expect to have more information for our PALCI colleagues in the coming weeks and months about how we are approaching controlled digital lending with the reshare community, with the CDL implementers group, as well as with others. So, so thank you so much to everybody for attending. Thanks especially for our panelists. And you can watch for the slides and the recording coming out very soon. We'll email everybody who's registered. So thanks, everybody. Have a great day.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Thank you.